Mark Harris, who teaches at Metropolitan State University of Denver. And our ensemble here is made up of students from Metropolitan State College, as well as some middle schoolers from a Denver public school called Slavin's K-8. And they have all been working on sound painting for a couple of years now. And so I'm going to let Mark start, and then we'll talk about how it incorporates the brain.
Evans Elementary, and Atlanta.
So when I first saw sound painting, and I wish you could see their faces, because they come alive in a whole new way when they're sound painting, and in a little bit you'll get to experience that on your own. So I'm not going to give too much of the rest of Mark's away. But when I first saw this, I started thinking, where is the intersection between music making, the act of creating sound, and the brain? Because you can actually see their brains working in this very unusual way while they're doing this improvisatory act. So scientists have long known that music is a whole brain activity, and we just saw grand evidence of that. And virtually every musician at some point has either heard and or repeated why music is intrinsically good for your brain. My own children, including this one, can on an instant notice roll their eyes and quote scripture and verse about the rule in our household that you have to play an instrument until you are at least 18. It is one of the only activities that utilizes both sides of the brain simultaneously. It is also an activity that forces engagement on both a physical and mental level, calling on both rote memorization, recognition of notes, performance techniques, and aesthetics, how to make something sound beautiful or harsh or anywhere in between. Typical lore expects one to wait many years to see the benefits of musical training on the brain. Occasionally, though, one runs into something where you can virtually see the brain working in this dual fashion. In the last 2 years, I was introduced to just such a new style of performance, the one you just witnessed, which is called sound painting and was created by a man named Walter Thompson. Sound painting is a type of collective improvisation led by a facilitator, here Mark Harris, the conductor, who gives spontaneous hand signals, of which there are over 1,200, to create various types of sound, motion, durations, rhythms, etc. Thompson describes sound painting as, quote, a living and growing language. Watching people, especially musicians, perform using sound painting often within minutes of being introduced to it, and seeing their comfort level with improvisatory creation rise exponentially with every opportunity made me wonder, what is significantly different about this style of performance? What does improvisation provide or give to us or give to our brain that other types and styles of performance do not? Obviously, there is a creative aspect to improvisation that is valued in our society. To be able to pick up an instrument and perform captivating sounds extemporaneously leaves listeners and audiences wowed and awed, as well as giving performers a satisfaction and endorphin push that is unique. Collective improvisation, creating spontaneously in a group, takes away at least a portion of the most common roadblock performers experience and express about individual improvisation, namely fear and intrinsic risk. Will I be able to get back to that place, that harmonic key, that melody that I need to be in a classical concerto? Or will I be able to get back to the bridge in a jazz piece? Added to that is, as Mark Harris has noted, quote, the intrinsic joy of creation in a group setting, a simple joy of exploration and discovery and delight as a group, a fundamental joy on a more basic level, derived from being a group making up something right now that had not existed before, and is not necessarily something to be judged as good or bad, but is delightful because we made it up. Humans like to make things together, to be accepted and contribute, and that is one of the great attributes of sound painting and the other group improvisational experiences, end quote. The key question then becomes, what is the physiological difference between improvisatory creation and any other type of performance? It turns out a few key scientists have asked that same question, and there are concrete differences that occur in the brain during improvisation versus rote, memorized, or read music. Artistic creativity is magical, but is not magic, says physician, researcher, and jazz musician Charles Lim. Significantly, there is evidence that while difference exists, at least in how it affects the brain between trained musicians and amateurs and or beginners, it may not be as dissimilar as one might presume. By and large, if music affects the brain globally, as again noted by Charles Limb, what part of the brain is involved when you improvise? Quite an interesting area, as it turns out. The part of the brain that becomes most active during improvisation is the prefrontal cortex. By and large, the prefrontal cortex is responsible for much of the human brain's higher cognition and complex social behaviors, including but not limited to episodic retrieval, language, semantic tasks, and attention. However, within the prefrontal cortex, during improvisatory exercises, most interestingly, there is a pattern of increased activity in the medial prefrontal cortex and decreased activity in the lateral areas of the prefrontal cortex. How do we know this, and what does it mean? Two major studies have been done around improvisation, both using an fMRI, functional magnetic resonance imaging machine, in a controlled environment. These studies use bold, blood oxygen level dependent imaging with the theory that increased blood flow correlates to increased brain activity, a method accepted since the mid-1990s. Aaron Berkovitz, an ethnomusicologist, and Daniel Ansari, a neuroscientist, conducted the very first study, published in 2008. Their study looked specifically at how a musician's brain responded differently when playing a scripted melody versus when improvising. All of the test subjects were classically trained musicians, and they played pre-memorized 5-note melodies and then performed 3 improvisatory acts, one around rhythm with a set melody, one around melody with a preset rhythm, and one where rhythm and melody were freely improvised. 3 regions of the brain were activated during all improvisatory acts. First, the anterior cingulate, significant for cognitive tasks and decisions in conflicting situations. Second, the dorsal premotor cortex, providing information about where the body is in space and how to negotiate around in space. This region was active during both aspects of performing, but became significantly more active when performing improvised music. And third, the inferior frontal gyrus ventral premotor cortex, the key area for comprehension and production of language, and the area most affected during the renowned Stroop test, wherein test subjects are shown a color word, say blue, but the word is written in the color red, and they have to answer the word red instead of blue. I failed miserably at this. Berkovitz is particularly interested in this connection to language because he theorizes that the process of learning to improvise is similar to that of learning a second language. It is all about memorizing vocabulary words, useful phrases, and verb conjugation tables. This is similar to chord tables and structural aspects of music, of creating a palette from which one can work. Eventually, Berkovitz says, through constant practice, these processes get pushed down into the subconscious and become routine, and you begin to free associate. In 2010, Berkovitz and Ansari published a separate study looking at musicians versus non-musicians. This study is even more fascinating because a difference between musicians and non-musicians was discovered. The difference occurs in the temporoparietal junction, the area responsible for recognizing when a new event occurs and draws our attention. For instance, a door opens and a person walks in during a concert, distracting one momentarily from your task at hand. When musicians were performing memorized music, this sector was active, but during improvisation, it powered down. Non-musicians maintained activity in this sector of the brain in both improvised and non-improvised activities. Theoretically, this means musicians improvising are better at blocking out extraneous stimuli, perhaps as they move further into the zone. However, what is even more fascinating is that a separate study found that there seems to be no difference in terms of cognitive processing between a simple scalar improvisation and a more rhythmically complex harmonic improvisation, which suggests that level of expertise might not be as significant to achieving that powering down of the temporoparietal junction. In other words, this information might in turn be used in educational settings. Charles Limb, working with Alan Brown from the National Institute of Health, conducted this second study. Limb and Brown were specifically looking into which regions of the brain are active during jazz improvisation. The study isolated very specific aspects of the brain that were activated and deactivated during improvisation. There was specifically a surge in medial prefrontal activity, where both self-expression and complex long-term multitasking take place, and a large deactivation in the lateral prefrontal areas, where self-restraint, self-consciousness, and judgment take place. And this is one of the scans from one of his test subjects from an fMRI. Lim notes that self-expression center is part of what is known as the default network, and that the deactivation of the lateral areas might suggest suspension of conscious control, enabling freer, more spontaneous thoughts and actions. In other words, these areas power down, allowing us to be willing and able to assume risk and work more creatively. Lim is, as a scientist, cautious about implications and warns against making anything in the brain neat and tidy. However, he does theorize that understanding what reduces conscious self-monitoring, what a lot of musical experts are doing, has implications for describing what gives rise to excellent improvisation. How a teacher can take that and utilize it in a lesson is another thing entirely, but I think, he says, there's food for thought. For Lim, this is significant because we need to learn how creativity affects the brain and how to implement creativity in educational systems, how to encourage children to be creative. In turn, the ideas behind understanding the brain's reaction and opening up performers to assume more risk with less judgment and self-monitoring is significant because creativity often endows the performer and the listener with emotional gratification and pleasure. Lim is now interested in why do we receive pleasure from this act, but also, for example, in the age-old philosophical questions, including, why does sad music make us happy? Why do we love sad music? He believes the two are linked because, quote, improvisation creates a similar response, and wonders what then is the basis for the reward. Lim also sees a strong connection between jazz improvisation and rap or hip hop, which he says is what kids are doing spontaneously while they are growing up, and it incorporates language and rhythmic music equally. He has continued his studies using freestyle rappers with similar results. Above all, Lim is a pragmatist and admits he would love to see how other spontaneous acts stack up against music. However, there are limitations to an fMRI study. Anybody who's ever been in an MRI tube can only imagine. Painting and writing, for example, which occur over extended periods of time and not often in a loud tube, lying down with some modified instrument, are difficult to reproduce. For the moment, large-scale creative acts, painting a large canvas, writing a book, composing a long composition, working in a large ensemble, must rely on correlation and hypothesis. Within both Lim and Berkowitz's studies, there are pieces of the puzzle that are still missing. Lim and others are looking into how other genres of music function and thinking forward into what the ramifications are for education. What sound painting does is to work on these fronts simultaneously as scientific research tries to catch up. What we, as musicians and musicologists, do in the meantime is try to connect the two together. Hypothetically, since research has discovered similar brain activity in improvisation with classical music, jazz, and now hip-hop, any type of spontaneous music making should trigger the same responses in the brain. As spontaneous musical conversations take place, you are, in essence, motoring down your lateral prefrontal cortex and engaging your medial prefrontal cortex, powering down self-judgment and restraint, and in opening yourself up to more creativity. The musicians that you see in front of you involved in sound painting over time do all the things that we have talked about. They free associate, they create palettes, they work spontaneously with one another, and they become more and more confident with their instruments and their creativity, both together and individually, as they practice. And this final note is significant because the two things every researcher found was not just the correlation between whole brain activity and music, but also the fact that expertise goes up only as practice time increases. The more you practice, the better your brain becomes. So, as part of that, to show you, this is a professional group in Oslo for a senior recital at the university. And this is Walter Thompson, who's facilitating or conducting. And you'll notice he's giving them signals even as they're trying to get themselves prepared. He starts right in. I'm going to let Mark take back over and explain to you a little bit more about the process of creating a sound painting piece.
Thanks, Petra, and thanks for having us here. I prepared some things to say, but I'm going to ditch most of them, I think, because I want us to sound paint here, because I think it's a very unique experience. I'll say a few things. I'm a saxophone player. I've spent a lot of time improvising in a whole bunch of different styles and genres and situations and so forth. And I found that improvising has really informed all the music I do. I play a lot of classical music. I play rock. I play free jazz. I play all kinds of stuff. And I've really come to believe that it's an essential element of music education. That's kind of what motivates me to do a lot of this stuff. I don't know if you guys have had this experience, but when I was growing up, I learned to play the saxophone. I was in band. They taught me, the fingerings for 4 notes, and they put me in front of a stand and said, "Here are those 4 notes on some manuscript paper." And from that point on, pretty much all I did was follow dots across the page. And there's nothing wrong with that. I'm not saying there's at all. However, I didn't ever get asked to just make a simple melody, for instance, or relate to 2 other people in the group, just with sound in some way or another. And I found that there is a certain sort of magic, number 1. Number 2, that it really fires all this stuff we're talking about. It makes my brain work. And one of the things that sound painting does, as does all of this improvisational stuff, is it makes us really ask a lot of questions. And it makes us make musical decisions in the moment, for instance. We're sort of confronted with what is music when we're improvising, because we have to decide in the moment. I want to do something that contributes to what's going on, that makes what we're hearing sound better somehow. So we have to make a whole bunch of aesthetic decisions, but we also have to make decisions about how am I going to contribute to what's going on? How can I accompany my colleagues? What will best suit what's going on right now? Maybe the best thing to do is to not play. That's a good thing too. Anyway, so one of my quests is to sort of help get improvisation into public schools, basically, as a regular part of what they do. And national standards are sort of changing and moving that way at this point too, which helps. Anyway, so a couple years ago I brought Walter to MSU, and he did some workshops and worked with a lot of these folks. And I want to thank you guys, Lena and Aiden and Allie and Ballard and Emma and Lucas for coming up to play today, and thanks to their parents for getting them here and through the traffic and everything. Anyway, I want to get more improvisation into schools. And sound painting is a thing I think that has tremendous potential, because when you sound paint, you can get people of all different instruments, all ages, all experiences, all genres, everything. He's sound painted with 100 lawyers before, for instance, So it really doesn't matter what you do. All that matters is that you're willing to jump in and participate, right? It's not based on skill level or anything like that in any way. And I think it has tremendous value as an educational tool and potential to get folks to play together and to really open up their sort of the creative aspects of their brains. So I've worked with Christmas Gainsborough, who is you guys' band director for a couple of years in all kinds of improvisational settings. And she's kind of responsible for me being able to work with these guys. How about just a short question? How many folks in here had any sort of significant improvisational experience in your education when you were playing? I'm definitely a minority of folks, I would say that, right? Okay, that's kind of what I expected, because that was my experience too. Well, here's what I'd like to do. I want to get all this sound painting, so I'm going to adjust things here a little bit so I can wave my arms, and I'll be right back. No, you guys want to go out there? Why don't you do that? So, yeah, if you guys can go out and sit next to somebody out there, and they'll have questions. Now, that was the other thing I wanted to say too, is that if there are questions at any time, don't hesitate, just speak up, okay? It would be hard. You need a facilitator, a sound teacher. I improvise with folks without sound painting a lot, in just a very free, open way. Oh yeah, absolutely. We spend time doing it. We do a whole bunch of different sort of approaches to open improvising. Sometimes we just play, textures, the weather, whatever. All right. Anyway, so. If you got that handout, the last page, so there is definitely a syntax to sound painting. The first gesture that you will get is a who gesture, so this means everybody. Okay, so if I'm doing this, I want everybody to do something, right? The next gesture would be what. So a nice place to start with is start on the what side of things. This is a long note, that's all it means, right? And this is range specific, so we can high and low, basically. High note, middle, low. What it is up to you, okay? Then there are go and stop gestures. So go gesture in sound painting is this, and the stop gesture is this, okay? So let's do this. We're going to be sound painters right now. Wait. Very good. Now, I would like to point out you are all now improvisers, right? I didn't tell you what note to play. I didn't tell you how loud to play it. I didn't tell you what tone quality to use. I said nothing, right? You made those decisions. And that's, again, one of the very cool things about sound painting is that you make so much of the musical content decisions about what goes on. So it is a truly collaborative sort of experience, right? All right. So I have long notes. This means...
Down a pitch.
Thank you. Good enough. Did you hear that? Down a step or a half step. Not a fourth or fifth. And this is the opposite, up a step or half step too. Okay? One more thing. This is a volume fader here. Okay? Loud, soft. That's all it means. Okay? So, this means a wavy long note, whatever that means to you. Okay? So then I can do this. I want that to be loud, right? There are a couple, I'll lose some of these clarinets now too.
That's me.
There are a couple of regions for the sound painter too. One is a neutral position where I would be gesturing and conveying some sort of information to you, right? And then when I step into this sort of imaginary box in front of me, that's the go place, that's the action place, right? So I would be saying, okay, everybody, play a high note, hang on, I want it to be really soft, wait for a second, now, go, step in front of me, right?
Okay.
Or, you're playing already, and you're playing along the la, and I'm doing this, but I'm standing in the box until you do it in real time. Now what I can do is, we're playing that long note, I step back here, and I go like this, and then we wait, because I'm not in the box yet, then I go like this, and then you change, right? Does that make sense? So let's try this. Yeah. This is the rest of the group. So, this is the whole group, rest of the group, so I can specify this half of the room, okay? This. You want me to do hits? Okay. I'm getting some coaching here. All right, so let's do that, right? So this gesture means individual hits, single short notes, right? This is range specific and intensity specific, right? And this is another thing, and actually I'll do shape line in a second here, but one of the things that I think is really fascinating about this is getting an ensemble to respond to a director, because this, I think, also applies to what goes on in music education. We want folks to respond to the conductor, whatever they're doing, right? So, if a band director, I think, works with sound painting a little bit, you can develop a way of expressing what you want through music with your gestures in the normal music, right? So anyway, so we're going to do hits. So it would be like this. Bop!
whatever sound you want to make. And that reminds me of something else too, which is, another beautiful thing about sound painting is that any sound is good. All sounds are good. They're all equal, basically, right? I'm not telling you you need to make a certain tone quality, and along with that is the fact that we can explore every timbre that we can imagine with sound painting too, which is something else we don't get to do in a lot of formalized music settings in schools, right? Where there's a particular sound we're trying to make that's beautiful for that music, right? But it also sort of limits us and doesn't allow us to explore whatever else our instruments can do and whatever sounds they can make, right? So, let's do this. This just means this is